But now we're moving to methodological paradigms, methodological issues. But I'm also actually going to theorize quite a bit, because really we are going to talk about the theories underpinning methods. So if we take theory as the way in which we systematically reason, make decisions, make our choices credible and informed, if that's what we mean by theory, to be systematically reflecting on the decisions we make, then all the decisions you make about your research questions, about the data, about your analytical framework, everything that we call methodology, are also theoretically underpinned. So don't put theory away yet, just because that lecture is finished and we're moving to something else. Actually, theory is going to be very important to think about methodological issues. So this is something that you can start reflecting already. You don't have to wait until the end. Why should we call what we do as applied linguistics research? So what is it? The attributes that we associate with applied linguistics, that we are doing applied linguistics or we are not doing applied linguistics. So my question, both for yourselves and for me, is what makes it different from non-applied linguistics research? Okay. So the moment we move to, and I'll come to that, applied science, applied research, then many people are dealing with real-world problems. It's not just linguistics and applied linguistics, sociology and psychology and anthropology. So applied science is not restricted to linguistics and applied linguistics. So this is just a way in which to get started. It's a warming up. So when I want to frame my research, and I want to call it something applied science, let's say, what does it mean? Does it mean I have to formulate my problem, research question, in a different way than a pure basic research question, which might be very descriptive, might be simply wanting to understand a particular phenomenon? Actually, understanding might not be an applied, it might be a basic research ground, a basic research platform. Or, and these are not or, is it something about how the relationship between the researcher and the researched is played out, it's manifest? Maybe that's what makes it applied, that we work with our stakeholders, we work with the participants. So maybe this is relational in that sense that Lars was talking about as well. So maybe applied linguistics is relational research. We are not just asking a question about what in an objective, phenomenological way, we're also asking it in an experiential way. What would the experience of working with the students, working with the social workers, working with the nurses? Like in action research, participatory research, interventionist research. So maybe these are the kind of things that we might call applied rather than basic. Or, and, should applied linguistics be differently oriented to theory, methodology, and analytical frameworks, including crossing disciplinary boundaries? Maybe applied linguistics should not be loyal to any particular discipline. And we know that historically, that you might come from pedagogy, from psychology, from philosophy, from anthropology, and by the way, linguistics. So in that sense, applied linguistics already is not a discipline. I would call it an interdiscipline. It's already interdisciplinary. So therefore, maybe once you call yourself applied linguist, you have the license to pick and choose whatever you like from wherever you want, because there is no discipline involved here yet. Or, and actually, it should have some relevance, some practical relevance, some utility. So my research is not the what and why, but how it could make a difference. So once we become committed to making a difference to what we are studying, and that implies us transforming ourselves as researchers, as human beings, as scholars. So doing research, if not changes the world, at least should change you. Otherwise, what's the point? So your thinking, your understanding must change through the process of inquiry, the process of research. And that's what something that is nowadays being called translational research. Can the research findings be translated into something practically relevant, useful? Even if it's for 5 people, a small group of 1 classroom, that's perfectly fine. So maybe that is what makes it applied linguistics research, and that is why I asked the question anticipating that kind of an outcome. So sometimes the outcome orientation might determine the kind of questions you should ask. Maybe not ask too big a question, because by asking that question, you might move away from the practical relevance. So that is something, maybe what makes applied linguistics something different from just doing science or just doing linguistics. Is it all of these? Are there other things? So have a think about your own work in terms of where do you start and what end point you already have in your mind. Where do you want to stop? Where do you want to end? So that you can say, okay, I started there, but actually it never got into the practical end of things. So my research is it started applied, no longer applied. That's perfectly fine. So what we'll try in this lecture is to look at some of the methodological challenges that are underpinning many of the applied science. So I put linguistics just in the middle because much of what I'll say would apply to any science which is trying to be applied. So biomedical sciences to social sciences to psychology, anthropology. You can think of any humanistic or more natural sciences, but much of the natural computing is a good example of applied science. Then we have to think about the positioning of the researcher, the you. Who are you? Not what and how and why, but who. Who are you? In what position you put yourself into the research site? Are you invited? Do people want you to do the research? Or have you imposed yourself? Because that can change the whole rule of the game. If you are something like an intruder to somebody's life, somebody's work, it's a very different thing than being invited to, please, can we have your expertise, your help in solving the problem? And this is our problem. Somehow I also feel that we need to move beyond describing phenomena. That could be very basic and pure, it's very descriptive. So what is it that we have to go beyond description? And maybe that would come to explaining what is not only we see, but why something is a pattern, why something recurs, and what could explain that. And something I'll come at the very end, it's very provocative, is when you want to be a real applied linguist, you might have to sacrifice rigor. The things that are required of a PhD, things that are required methodologically very straightforward, following procedures systematically, maybe that is too rigorous to be relevant. So rigor and relevance are not the same thing. Are we prepared in a PhD research when you are defending your thesis? Can you actually go for the relevance path by forsaking rigor, what is expected of a PhD dissertation? And that's where we have to ask ourselves whether my research is more practically oriented or is more within the template of an institutional framework, the system, where it can be defended with 4 articles, a monograph, whatever. So we need to think about this issue about how practical can we become and what might be the cost of being too practical. So this is what I'll try to do. I don't know how far I'll get, but all these things will probably come up tomorrow in your presentations. And I thought of 5 Ps to make it memorable. So we'll talk about lots of Ps. The pyramid, we'll talk about paradigms, we'll talk about positioning, we'll talk about practice, we'll talk about profiling. So I'll try to address them. There won't be that much time. It's an attempt to cover as much as I can, to raise many issues. I'm very much hopeful that many of these issues will come up tomorrow in your presentations about how to engage with the data, the practice of coding, categorizing, analyzing data, how to position yourself as an insider, outsider, in between, the liminal space. You're neither insider nor outsider. What happens? What are the paradigms, even if you want to do mixed methods? What can you mix and what cannot be mixed? Okay. So there are those kind of issues that we'll talk about and hopefully end with what does it mean to become a qualitative researcher. So I'll be focusing more on qualitative research, although we should talk a little bit about the two paradigms, quantitative and qualitative. So let's start with what I see the research as a pyramid with three important points, if you like. So on the top is your goal. What is it that you want to do? Your research questions should reflect that. So having asked the questions, we need to now come down to the two other things. What is the method through which I'll answer that question? Okay. And to me, any discussions about methods and methodology is really about theorizing our decisions about data, theorizing our decisions about who should be the participants that we should recruit, the recruitment strategy, the site to study. So all these are theoretically instructed or informed in the decisions about data. So for me, method is basically theory of data. Okay. Why interviews? Why not focus groups? Why structured interview? Why not semi-structured? So all these decisions have to be theoretically justified. So don't think of methodology as atheoretical. Nothing is atheoretical. Everything has a theoretical underpinning, a systematic rationalizing that defines and drives what is it that we want to do. Likewise, when we come to having the data, we have to analyze. And I would call this a theory of interpretation. What are the theoretical grounds that you have to firmly position yourselves in to engage with the data? Because you have 100 different analytical frameworks. You can do corpus linguistics, you can do content analysis, you can do critical discourse analysis, you can do so many different things. So then we have to theorize what kind of interpretation will align with the data we have to answer the question. So immediately, once we think of these three things in a pyramid, here is the challenge. How can I align these three things in my work? So my research questions are such that the data justifies. So we have the right kind of data to answer that question. If I don't, I have to reframe my research question. Otherwise, there is a mismatch, misalignment. If that is what my data is and that's the question I ask, then what kind of analytical framework I should choose? Unless you have a perfect alignment between these three, the research somewhere would be disaligned or misaligned or somehow fall between the stools. So this is going to be a recursive process by which you redefine your questions as you go along because the data you expected did not materialize. The data cannot be put to that kind of quantification or qualification or whatever, so I better change my question. I take out the why. So why do people fail? Now I can't answer that. So better to say, how do they account for the failure? Can you see that you have reframed the research question because that's what your data can only answer. So sometimes we begin to think, should we start with the research question? Usually your institutional supervisory bodies would expect you know exactly what you want to find out. Actually, most of us don't. Definitely not in qualitative research. So framing a research question as a required template before you can be accepted for a PhD is some kind of a paradox. But we still believe in that. We don't believe in that, but we practice it. So if we begin with research questions, our assumption is that then the data collection will follow in year 2, analysis will happen in year 3. Wow. That's a very straight, linear line. Okay? We know exactly what will happen when. No surprises. But unfortunately, that is not how research progresses or anybody's experience, including mine. If you take a position that I should begin with a research question, it assumes you already know what questions to ask before you know your data, which is impossible. Okay? Unthinkable, unrealistic. Unless it is a very broad question, like why does it snow in December? If that kind of a question you are interested in, of course you can start with that. But I'll come to that. That's a topic, an interest. It's not a question yet. So never confuse a research domain, a research terrain, a research topic as your research question. So I work in ecolinguistics, sociolinguistics. Those are domains. They are not research questions. You have to ask a very specific question that you will be able to answer through your data and your framework. So we cannot begin with an assumption that we already know where, what, and when, and how to get data. In most cases, we don't. We just have a rough idea. I'll collect data from this multinational company, from the hospital, from the classroom, but you really don't know what you'll be faced with when you get to the site. The other alternative would be to let the data determine your question. Sounds very practical, on the ground, okay? So in other words, just enjoy your first year of PhD. Don't do anything because you haven't got your data yet. So unless you have the data, you can tell, you can quote me, according to Sarangi 2019, no research until data is collected. So now the research question will not be asked until year 3. That's not realistic either. The third one, which many people do, what they don't confess, they don't admit, they have already decided their analytical framework. I'll do conversation analysis. I'll do dialogue analysis. I'll do corpus linguistics. I'll do discourse analysis. You have already decided through your training, through your exposure from the system. So you have already decided your analytical framework before you know your data, which is also very untenable. Actually, that raises all kinds of questions we are talking about. What is it that you want to commit yourself to before you have started on the journey? Because if the analytical approach is already predetermined, that sounds like almost being theoretically driven how you are going to look at your data without knowing what the data would be. So the first thing we can say is research is not a linear process, it's more recursive. So one of the things that I suggest, we could say, I begin with a research, broad research topic, question, but I am open and flexible to change it. And I'm sure every system should allow that. How do we change the research question? By reading more. So the literature, the more we read, the more we begin to ask better questions, more informed questions. We also can change the research question after we have got our hands dirty with the data. So now this is what I have as my data. So now I better revisit the research question, and that should be perfectly fine and actually a smart move. The data and the question must be aligned, must somehow speak to each other. You must believe, if you are doing qualitative research, that such research ends with questions, not answers. If you don't believe it, then don't do qualitative research. Because qualitative research always ends up with more questions. You started somewhere, you asked something, you ended up with more questions before you can explain what you have found. So ending with questions rather than something that is much more a kind of a solution to the problem or some kind of an answer to the question you had asked is not qualitative research, ethnographic and otherwise. And as I said, the research topic domain should not be confused with the research question. So in the first few months of your PhD life, and I'm addressing most of you as PhDs here, if somebody says, what's your research question? Say, I don't have one. I have a research topic. I know which field I'm working in, okay? But I don't have a research question yet. I think that should be acceptable to supervisors, to peer group. You shouldn't be under stress. Oh my God, it's already 3 weeks, I don't have a question. The more you become question-oriented, the more you're likely to change it, which gives a very bad impression that you are keeping changing your questions. So better not to have one in the first place than keeping changing them every week. Supervisors don't like it at all. Okay, you come for the next meeting and say, oh, by the way, I have changed my research question. That's not very good. So in other words, try to find some kind of a period, like a latent stage in a PhD process journey, that take your time to frame your question. And the reason I'll show in a minute. One thing, and that connects to some of the things we talk about, is theory-method interface. And there is a lot of confusion about what is theory and what's method. There's a lot, and we might want to come back to this. But the starting point is, what good is theory if it is not practical and usable? So there are good theories and there are bad theories. There is good science and bad science. Okay? So if you have got into a theoretical frame of mind, but actually you can't do anything with it, with your question, with your data, with your framework, maybe it is not good. Although you have a theory, but it is something tangential to what you're interested in, what you want to find out. So make sure that the theory is useful. In a very ironic way, all theories must be practical. Rather than imposing theory on data, which can happen in some traditions, okay? Alternatively, allow theory to emerge, as in grounded theory, and we'll talk about that a little later. But more basically ask, does your empirically framed question require theory in the outset? Do I need a theory at the beginning? So let me get to theory when it is needed. Because many questions that we ask empirically, and that's why we call it empirical research, should not have a theoretical premise in the beginning, which is against any kind of qualitative inquiry. So again, just like it is no shame to say you don't have a research question, be very shameless and say I don't have a theory. That's perfectly fine. Okay. So not be theoretically oriented beginning. Of course, you might have something theory later on, but not to engage with your data at the outset. And there is a lot of theoretical bias in empirical research, whether it is applied or not. So there are two things, is the art of choice and the art of rejection. Please feel free to reject things. Don't accept everything that is told, that's written about. So just like we have to have a choice of what we can do, and many applied scientists would say, try to ask a question which is problem-led, problem-based. So that's something that you will be engaged with a lot more because it's a problem you want to solve, like a puzzle. But anything that becomes a very problem-focused, problem-led, you have to do some kind of a assessment, feasibility study. Is it doable in 3 years? Can it make into 4 articles? Will it become a monograph I can write at the end of the time? Do I have the resources to get all the data I want? So all these things then become very important. And as I say here in a quote, actually framing questions should take more time than finding answers. So that is true of much scientific work. So if you have not taken enough time, have not done enough thinking about your question, then you might be in trouble about finding answers to them. So in other words, actually it's a good sign that you are still thinking about what question to ask. The art of rejection, I think about John Milton, the epic Paradise Lost. He came up with 100 titles, so he rejected 99 before he decided what should be the title of this epic poem. So an art of rejection is a corollary to the art of choice. So in other words, you have to always compute and calculate, if you like, what are the risks of going this way, doing multi-method, mixed methods, and so on, because there might be a price to pay rather than just simply putting them together. And they may not work all in unison or in sync. When it is a PhD research, you always get very ambitious, and we have some ambitious questions we'll hear tomorrow, that we want to ask big questions. Why not? This is our chance. So let's ask a question which will change the face of pedagogy, which will change social welfare and e-health literacy and whatnot. The more bigger questions we want to ask, the more difficult they are to answer. And not to ask them, and that's a very big paradox, not to ask them means you can only understand, I keep using the term understand from the last lecture, but you can only understand in part of something that is only part of a whole. So your understanding is bound to be fragmented, partial, selective, but that's not a bad thing. So if we take the view that our question is feasible within a PhD framework, our understanding is bound to be partial, it's bound to be fragments, ironic, or even isolated, because we'll never get the whole picture. And one final comment before I move to the next part is what kind of data are we talking about? Very crudely speaking, there are only two types of data. Observational, things that you can observe, and elicited, things you can ask for. So observational is actually data that exists with your interest being declared. In other words, documents, policies, websites, a clinic, a classroom, they would have happened anyway. It's just that you happen to be interested in doing a PhD. So any documented documents, texts, websites, fieldwork, all those things can be observational data. Questionnaires, focus groups, interviews are elicited data. These data would not have existed if you didn't show an interest in interviewing people, in sending a questionnaire, and so on. So that's elicited data. And as you can imagine, with elicited data, you as a researcher are more involved because you are asking the questions, you are doing the interaction, whereas, or designing the questionnaire. But when you are doing observational studies, although you are participating, filming, and taking notes, you are not interfering with the business of what is going on. And we can all socialize very differently and to different degrees to what these are, what these communities of practice are, and what these interests might be, or what I call the communities of interest. But I'll skip that and come back later.